featured actor as at least 3 different characters on the same show and ultimately becoming a new permanent character.
That's so unusual.
I've never
right?
heard of that.
This high-end restaurant concept is now not just the restaurant, but it's also the chef who runs that restaurant and how big of a media personality he becomes or she becomes on something like YouTube.
I'm Hugh Honey, and I'm here with my co-host, Vic Vinegar. Hi, Vic.
Hi, how's it going, Hugh?
Good. I'm coming in hot today, Vic.
Sounds like it.
I got some good stuff to talk about. So on my list this week, I watched the Always Sunny podcast. Have you seen this? Have you heard about this?
I haven't, no.
So you know the show Always Sunny in Philadelphia?
I do.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So they're on their 400th season or whatever it is.
It's still on.
Oh, yeah, still running. They're actually, I think, finishing up scripts for the next season right now, season 16, maybe?
I was just going to say, is it 16 or 17 seasons, right?
Wow, true fan. I love that.
Yeah, huge.
So they also have a podcast, and it's ostensibly to talk about the making of different episodes, and they completely go off topic every single time. They've got a little bit of a Seinfeld vibe on their podcast, where I think they were supposed to talk about an episode that they recorded from season 1, but in the podcast episode about that TV episode, they got more interested in breaking down doors. So they arranged to have a door that they could try breaking down different ways to see what would happen. So anyway, they go a bit off topic. So they did an episode of the podcast recently on probably one of the best episodes of the show. And I know it's a matter of opinion, but it is absolutely a classic. Did you ever see the episode where the gang puts together a musical called The Nightman Cometh?
No, I haven't really watched that show, to be honest.
So good. You would love it. Absolutely recommend it. Let's see. It's season 4 from 2008, I think, is when they recorded that. So Nightman Cometh is a musical written by Charlie, who's the sort of the janitor part of the crew there at the bar. And he writes a musical for no reason, apparently. And it's about a boy who is visited by a troll and the Nightman. And then the boy has to overcome this and, become the Dayman to fight the Nightman off. So there's a whole musical around it. And the episode is about the gang making the musical. And it's got a lot of original music in it and performances. And of course, Danny DeVito is a cast member and he sings a song and everything. And it's really funny. I highly recommend it. So anyway, the podcast episode they did was about that, and they were talking about the music and the production, and they had a special guest come on to talk about that episode, a super fan that they brought on to talk about that, and it was Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Really?
Who is the playwright from Hamilton, the musical. Yeah. So he's apparently a huge fan, and he was super excited to talk about how they came up with those ideas and the musical stylings, and it was really entertaining. It was really interesting, and I just thought I'd recommend it.
He's a pretty funny guy, Lin-Manuel. He was on Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Really?
For a few episodes. Yeah.
Huh. Was he playing himself?
He was playing himself. Yeah. He's really good. He has really good comedic timing, and he was really funny against Larry.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. You should definitely watch that if you get a chance. Because I always think of him as a playwright. I don't think of him as an actor, but obviously he's an actor too, because he was in Hamilton. But you always just see, the creator of Hamilton. But he's really funny. Really talented guy.
Well, he was great on this episode, and having never seen Hamilton, it was sort of my first exposure to him. I thought he was great. He talked a little bit too about his history, like how he got interested in what he does and who he studied under and things like that. And that was also interesting. So, I think a lot of people would enjoy this episode.
I'll give it a listen. I heard that he had created Hamilton when he was reading the Hamilton biography, on vacation or something on the beach. But for some reason he thought, hey, this would be really great as a musical with a hip hop angle to it, which is pretty unique. Taking the concept of the Hamilton biography and turning it into a musical in that way is really fascinating.
It's a very creative idea. Yeah. I wonder exactly what grabbed him and why, the sort of various influences that came together in his mind, kind of clicked.
Yeah. I wonder if he talks about it in an interview or
I'm sure
blog. I'm sure, right?
I'm sure, but you always wonder like how much of it is the story and how much of it is the reality. Not that people are always necessarily like impression managing, to some extent they might be, but also just not really knowing and trying to construct some sort of narrative that makes sense. It's sort of like, your dreams. People say they remember their dreams, but most of the time they probably just remember fragments. And then a fully awake, rational prefrontal cortex tries to turn that into a narrative, or a sequence that makes some sort of rational sense, at least by dream logic. But is that actually what they experienced while they were sleeping? It's sort of like if he tried to recount his moment of realization or his early creative thoughts around Hamilton, is that actually what happened, or just his best ability to kind of retroactively create a narrative that makes sense to him?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it might have just been just fragments of an idea, or maybe they didn't really make much sense until much later when he started writing it and then creating the narrative, like you said.
Yeah, like
I'm sure that happens a lot.
Like stars, right? Or Christmas lights, right? So points of light that may flash a close enough period of time that your brain assembles it into a pattern. And that's where creativity comes in, I don't know.
Like a constellation. I'm sure we do that a lot with our lives too, create these narratives constantly about our past that may or may not be true. And we just really believe them because later on they've been processed for so long that there's a story behind it. How you originally thought about moving to where you live now, for instance, it might have been a completely unrelated thought or something you saw that made you think of this place and suddenly you're there. But if you construct the story, it's more, I thought about this, then I thought about that, then this thing happened, and that's how I'm here. But that may not be the case at all.
Well, maybe you do that.
But you have full narratives.
I write everything down. I just flip a coin like Two-Face, for all of my choices.
Like the Dice Man.
I never heard of it.
It's about a psychologist who decides that his life is really boring and he needs to shake things up. So he thinks, if I roll die, I'm going to let the die control my fate from now on. It's a really popular novel from the 70s. It's a cult classic. So he'll say, let's say, for the number 1, I'm going, and it's all really over the top, crazy stuff that he starts doing. Like, I'm going to go downstairs and have sex with a neighbor if I roll a 1. If I roll a 2, I'm going to walk outside and talk to a stranger about XYZ. If I roll a 3, I'm going to do this. So everything becomes controlled by the dice. And then he starts teaching this idea to other people, and it becomes kind of like a movement.
It sounds like a mix between Fight Club and Yes Man with Jim Carrey.
Very much so. They probably took a lot of their ideas from this novel, and you could see how they did. I think the novel's from 1972, maybe, or maybe 1969. So it's a long, long time ago. But I read it just recently, and it was just a fascinating concept because he wanted to break free of all the constructs of society. And he thought the only way to really do that is to let randomness take over, or else he would constantly be doing what he thought he was supposed to be doing at any given moment. So it's interesting in that it puts him in really dangerous situations. He leaves his wife, for instance, and he starts setting up all his major decisions in his life around the die.
He can blame the die for doing the things he wants to do.
Yep. Yeah, basically. So he's working on this idea of like, who is he really? Like, how has his identity been formed? And he wants to destroy that and become something else completely, but he doesn't want to set a path for himself that he's determined. He wants to randomize it and kind of prove that you can be many different people, and that who you've become is just based on this social construct and these experiences that you have had that are just drawing you to this one particular place. But what happens if you just throw all that out the window? So it's a really interesting read. It's a little bit repetitive toward the end. You're like, I get it. I understand what's happening here. The concept, he kind of beats a dead horse toward the end. But the first 3/4 of the book are really interesting, how it happens and how other people are affected by those decisions, and how they also take on this idea of rolling die, and how it becomes a movement, and how the psychiatric community really is against it. And some people jump on, other people are really against him. And this whole idea that, what are you doing? You're ruining people's lives, because it'll be, someone committing a crime or not committing a crime, and you're just putting that in the hands of randomness, instead of making decisions that are moral or ethical. So he takes all of that out of the picture. But you find it very interesting.
Yeah, it does sound like there are layers there. And depending on how the author explores them, you would hit a natural dead end for some of those layers.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. It could be. Or it could be one of those things that masquerades as a bigger idea than it really is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It sort of dresses up a fairly simple concept, because it's like, well, how does he assign values to the numbers, right? Is that his id? Is that actually just who he wants to be? And he's afraid to be that person without the excuse of rolling a die.
Right.
If that's all it is, then it's far less interesting than if it's a interesting way for someone to deconstruct themselves and then explore alternative ways of identifying, the self. That could be interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's really what it's exploring. But I think he has this big conflict within himself and during a lot of points. Like, is he just doing this to do bad things or things he's always had impulses around? And he's just using the die to let him do those things? Or is he deconstructing himself and creating a new version of himself? And you could argue that he's not really creating a new version of himself because this is just random. So he's not really
a more outward facing. He's changing the outward facing version of himself, I guess. And maybe internally how he conceptualizes himself. But is he really fooling himself? You know what I mean? Like, there's not randomness truly here.
It dives into all of those questions in the book, and that's what becomes very interesting about the plot line.
Yeah.
But then, like I said, at the end, it
needs like a murder mystery or something to cap it,
Yeah,
political
it kind
thriller.
of devolves, like it just turns into, it's almost like he doesn't know how to end it correctly. Because once you get that point across about, is it an identity thing? Is it a randomness experiment? Is it an outward influences controlling his life? Or is it something that he's driving on his own? Once you get through those topics, you kind of explored all there is to explore. So he tries to create more of a solid plot around it at the end, and I don't think it works very well. But the concept, I think, is fascinating. I can see why it's a cult hit. And I think there's a sequel too. There might be 2 sequels.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So also, side note on that episode of Always Sunny, the original episode with the play or the musical in it, they did as a live show and they toured.
Really?
Yeah. They did that for a while and it was a big hit. And if you're on the internet anywhere, maybe YouTube Music or Spotify or Apple Music, you might find some fun covers of songs from that episode, like the Bumping Uglies and These City Limits did covers of the songs in very different styles and a lot of fun. If you like that episode, check out that music. It's inspired a lot of people in a lot of ways. So good stuff. I also wanted to mention, I don't know if you heard this, you probably saw it. Noma, the restaurant, is closing.
I did see that. Yes.
Yeah. So longtime #1 restaurant in the world, located in Copenhagen, has 3 Michelin stars. Like, they've been at the top of the pile. And the owners basically said it's not a sustainable model anymore for reasons we can get into. But I think it's really multi-causal. There have been a lot of shakeups in the restaurant industry. And so the creative vision here now is to transition the brand from primarily restaurant to like focusing on their food lab and making products for online sale, Whole Foods, stuff like that, and doing occasional restaurant pop-ups. So any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting direction. I went there probably over 10 years ago and tried to get a table. And I remember it vividly. I walked in and I asked the woman behind the desk if there were any reservations available. And she kind of laughed at me and she said, yeah, in about 6 months, but you can take our card. And that was,
you can take our card.
That was my experience at Noma.
That's nice. Hilarious. And you put your backpack back on and shuffled out the door, defeated.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. And then I went to Chipotle. That was it. It looked like a nice place. Yeah, I think it might be the cost of ingredients, right?
Yeah.
You think it's a saturated market in terms of...
This is one of those things where it's probably best for us not to get into it too much because it's not our area. But I will say that news
that's
coverage...
what we always do.
No, I think news coverage is focusing largely on this idea of paying interns. So as I understand it, again, not an expert, but a lot of the high-end restaurant market and maybe even, mid-tier and lower tier, they rely on some free labor, some, cheap labor, because the people who do that get a lot out of it. If you have an internship essentially and you're working for free at Noma, you're probably learning incredible things. And you may not be really contributing that much to them because you probably don't have skills on the level they need. But if you're willing to work hard for a certain period of time, you could maybe get up to the point where you're contributing. And if they're going to pay you to learn, then it really radically affects basically the cost of the meal, right? So they'd have to raise prices to crazy amounts that would just make it inaccessible to most people without that free labor. So I think the rules have changed in a lot of places. And that's one of, I'm sure, many, many, many elements of why the high-end restaurant model isn't working like it used to.
And their margins are typically very slim.
I mean, that's
the restaurant
point,
industry, right?
Yeah.
Extremely slim.
Exactly. Right. And I don't know that people really want to drag themselves to fancy restaurants as much as they used to, especially since the pandemic. And some of these restaurants are probably in a hole. And I mean, there's just a lot of things changing. And, also now, like if you have a food lab, like they apparently do, again, not my area, just what I've heard, then leaning into producing things and distributing them using, the existing network that's out there that wasn't there even 10 or 15 years ago makes a lot more sense now. And probably people are interested in cooking or using better ingredients at home. So that also opens up some new opportunities. And I think they're just going with what they think with where the opportunity is in the market.
I'm curious to see how that's going to work because they built up such a strong brand name around their restaurant, and if they do go into places, specialty food stores, Whole Foods, how people are going to take that. Are they just going to look at it as, oh, this is just a really high-end Michelin star restaurant with some overpriced ingredients or prepared food? Or is it going to translate from the restaurant experience or the idea of Noma into the home? That'll be interesting to see because I've never heard of this in the past. A restaurant, I mean, there's certain restaurants that have, let's say, jarred sauces, et cetera, but they're not that I've seen at the level of Noma, which you would think they're going to have a higher premium, a higher price point on those goods to make people really think they're coming from such a high-end restaurant. And are they going to be willing to pay for it?
Yeah. I remember coming by your place and opening up the freezer and it was just stocked full of frozen P.F. Chang meals. So I know there's a market for it.
They've got one customer, but I still have to eat all those meals to make room for it. So I'll let you know how that goes.
You got it. You got those Fridays mozzarella sticks frozen in your fridge, ready to go. Yeah. I mean, I think we'll see. And it's an interesting sign of a potential major shift that could really affect a lot of people's careers. I mean, people who might have scraped together enough money to go get paid or not get paid to live there and work, but learn and then go launch their own restaurants or, become a very successful, I don't know, pastry chef or something at a very high level. They may end up moving to a different segment of the market, which in this case could be like shipping. They might end up being a stock boy instead of cutting vegetables at Noma. And then where does that take their career? So I don't know. I think there's a lot of fluidity in the world right now. People trying to figure out how to sustain certain products and services while also respecting maybe or treating people who are new differently. I don't know. I don't know how to best put that in a way that's not going to upset people, but it's definitely going to change things.
Yeah, I think that whole industry is really being shaken up. I think the proliferation of these food competitions that you see everywhere, all the different shows like Iron Chef and the Great British Bake Off and all these other Chopped, et cetera, they're having a huge influence on how people view restaurants and this idea of the home chef recreating meals that they might have at a really high-end restaurant. That's become a big thing now. And having higher quality ingredients at home that you can recreate meals or having these boxes delivered with all the ingredients to make it this amazing meal that you can kind of put together yourself. And then on the other hand, with chefs now, it seems that they've moved from, the typical cookbook model that they had in the past. And maybe they'd go on TV and do one or two interviews on a morning show. And you kind of know about them, but not to the extent where things are now with YouTube them having their huge YouTube channels and TikTok and Instagram and all the social media platforms. So it seems that not only do you take, this high-end restaurant concept is now not just the restaurant, but it's also the chef who runs that restaurant and how big of a media personality he becomes or she becomes on something like YouTube that drives traffic to their restaurant. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting how many more chefs come out of that model, since it seems like content is shaking up everything when it comes to every industry. So if you don't have one of these outlets like a YouTube, how successful is your restaurant? Are you just dependent now on the food critics, on your cookbook line, or is it now dependent on how big of a personality you are? I would say how big of a media personality you are is really going to drive and influence the success of these super high-end Michelin star restaurants.
Very interesting. And I also like the idea of pop-ups because there's a lot of empty commercial real estate. And if you can establish a limited kitchen or get food delivered there and have a prefix meal, but you charge, extra because it's a special treat, then maybe you just, rotate around and do steady business that way because it's unusual in that particular area to have that restaurant or that menu. Maybe there's a sustainable version of that too.
Yeah, I think that model is becoming bigger and bigger. The guy who founded Uber also founded something called Cloud Kitchen, which is now this model where, let's say you're on Yelp and you want to order, let's say, Thai food. You order from the app and you get that food delivered to you, but there's no actual restaurant that you're ordering from. You're ordering from one kitchen where it may be the same chef is cooking Thai food, Chinese food, Malaysian food, Indonesian food. And that's become a big, big trend now, where you'll have these facilities where there's all these different kitchens. You're ordering food from all these different cuisines, but they're literally right next to each other. There's no seating. It's just all virtual.
Right. It's like an Amazon warehouse, but for cooking. Yeah.
Yep. So if you take a look at the address that they list, let's say on Yelp, it's listing the same address for, let's say 15 different restaurants with different cuisines, but they're all coming from the same place. So that's revolutionizing the way that a lot of, especially chefs that are just starting out, how they think about restaurants. So now it's not just the brick and mortar restaurant. It's this cloud kitchen concept that they have access to. They also have this, food hall concept where you can go in and get all different types of food, and the food truck. Those three big things, I think, are going to kind of change the whole landscape of both eating out and delivery.
Absolutely. So I also recently finished a rewatch of News Radio. Are you familiar with this? Have you heard about this?
Oh, yeah. Is that from the 90s?
Yes. 95, Joe Rogan's big breakthrough role as the tech/repair guy at a news radio station in New York City. Dave Foley from Kids in the Hall, huge fan of Kids in the Hall. Dave Foley's, I think that was his follow-up role to Kids in the Hall, sketch comedy show, Canadians. Did you ever watch Kids in the Hall?
No, I've heard about it though.
Classic stuff. Phil Hartman from Saturday Night Live. Also, I think it was his follow-up to Saturday Night Live. One of the most successful casts in the history of Saturday Night Live. I think he was part of the first really successful breakthrough cast after the original cast. With like Chevy Chase and those people. And also Andy Dick.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He did have a role on television.
He did. He actually had a few. He's had a lot of problems, which we'll talk about in a second. Stephen Root. What was that recent HBO show about the contract killer who wants to be an actor? Barry. Yeah. So Stephen Root was featured on that as well. So, all-star cast, a lot funnier than I remember it. I don't know if it's because now I get the jokes more, but certainly the first 3 seasons, there were a lot of fairly subtle for sitcom TV sex jokes that I don't really see anymore. Certainly not with kind of prime time, not family comedy, obviously, but it has that veneer of sort of family comedy, but there's a lot of pretty body sex jokes implied. Right. So very funny. I was laughing out loud, which I don't usually do when I watch sitcoms. It's certainly not from the 90s. Great show, though. So, I watched the whole thing again, really entertained. And it reminded me, do you remember between the 4th and the 5th season? Do you remember what happened?
Phil Hartman was murdered
by his wife. Yeah, exactly. That was 1998. Do you remember much about that?
Not too much. I remember hearing about it later but I didn't really follow the story too closely.
Yeah, so I did a little digging because I was curious, and a lot of it is now just sort of, well-known fact. I remember when it happened, it was absolutely tragic. I was a huge Phil Hartman fan, and I was enjoying news radio at the time. Obviously a little bit younger. I remember the footage from outside his home, the like live TV and everything like that. So anyway, backing up, Phil Hartman met and married his wife in 1987. She was a model and an actress when they met. And he was, becoming more and more successful on Saturday Night Live. So he was already pretty big, and, he married this woman. And from what I've heard, there was maybe some friction around a few things in their relationship, like his success sort of eclipsed hers, maybe was a source of a little bit of friction. But she also had developed a cocaine addiction, and it had a lot of problems around. I mean, obviously that's devastating typically for a marriage and a lot of close relationships because of what it does to you. But she had gotten clean and had been clean for a long time until the holiday party, I think it was the news radio holiday party. And Andy Dick apparently, again, allegedly, I wasn't there, but allegedly gave her cocaine at their Christmas party in 1997. And 5 months later, she murdered Hartman in his sleep, presumably while she was high.
Wow. That is such a tragedy. Wow.
Yep. And so Andy Dick was, I think hated, not just for that. He apparently also has had a string of crimes that he, like sort of weird crimes that he committed probably while high or drunk before that and since then. And he's sort of almost gotten back on his feet. I think he sobered up a few times and then had another meltdown off and on. He had a sketch comedy show on MTV briefly after news radio, but then I think it fell apart again when he relapsed. But so I don't know if you remember who replaced Phil Hartman on news radio. Remember that?
I don't. No.
John Lovitz.
Oh, yeah. Now I do remember that.
A couple interesting things about that to me. Anyway, I find this stuff interesting. First of all, John Lovitz had been on news radio twice before, at least, playing different characters both times. And yeah, so once he was, Phil Hartman was institutionalized. His character was institutionalized on the show. And John Lovitz was like another insane person or whatever who had, I think he had delusions of who he was. And so he was he was featured in the episode, not like cameo, like he was a main character in that episode. And then they brought him back on, I think it was in season 4, where he plays somebody who like hijacks the station with like a bomb on his chest and threatens to blow it up because he wants to get the message out about being mistreated by his employer. And then not that long after, especially if you binge it like I did, he comes back as another character who is like a radio announcer and gets hired, who was supposedly a friend of Phil Hartman's character. And then he gets hired as the replacement. He's a featured actor as at least 3 different characters on the same show and ultimately becoming a new permanent character.
That's so unusual.
I've never heard of that. Isn't that? It's like disorienting. It's almost like they don't really take their show that seriously, which comes across with the writing, which is, like a legitimate strategy, but it's unusual.
How did Phil Hartman get written off? You said he was institutionalized on the show?
No, that was just an episode where I think he got mad at a cop and they thought he was crazy or something like that. So he was just treating being institutionalized for a day or 2 or a week as a vacation. Mm-hmm. And then the character comes back. He was written off as having had a heart attack unexpectedly after the finale of season 4. And the season 5, it's a pretty touching episode where they remember him and everybody's sort of shocked and they have his memorial service. And there's some good. They bring back an actor who had left the show earlier in the run, who had worked with him, and she talks about him and stuff. Like they bring her back for an episode and so on. So it was interesting to see how they handled the loss of a main character. I mean, Phil Hartman's character is probably the second or third most important character on the show.
I see.
So the other interesting thing about Andy Dick is his behavior off screen was so erratic. Apparently, and this is something John Lovitz has talked about in interviews. So this is after Phil Hartman had been murdered and John Lovitz was now a permanent member of the cast. Andy Dick apparently made some comments about like John Lovitz not belonging there And John's response was like, well, I wouldn't be here if you hadn't done what you did and contributed to Phil Hartman's murder, like very confusing sort of antagonistic relationship. And John said that Andy Dick came up to him just, outside of the set, like at a restaurant or bar. Like I think John Lovitz was just sitting there, and Andy Dick came up and said, I put the Phil Hartman hex on you. You're the next to die.
Wow, that's dark.
Yeah. So a lot of conflict. You can do some digging if you're interested in learning more. There is more to the story, but really disturbed time in Andy Dick's life, I guess. Hopefully he's doing better now. But I think about like losing Phil Hartman. I think he and John Lovitz were probably friends. They certainly worked together for a long time on Saturday Night Live. I'm assuming that's partly why John Lovitz ended up a guest on news radio so many times and, sort of different roles, probably because of his relationship with Phil Hartman in part. Just a very bizarre part of TV history.
Mm-hmm. A very tragic, very tragic story.
Yeah, what a loss.
Yeah. You mentioned that cast, that SNL cast. So that was Adam Sandler?
Later, yeah. He was like, the 1.2 version of that cast.
Of that, yeah.
It was Dana Carvey and John Lovitz, Phil Hartman, Kevin Nealon. But yeah, it's a really classic cast. What is it? The original cartoons, Smigel cartoons, Insult Comic Dog, that guy. He did those animated bits.
Yeah, that was a good season or a good cast.
The ambiguously gay duo.
Mm-hmm.
They say your favorite SNL cast is the one you grew up with. Sort of the humor is at a certain level. So when you're developmentally at that level, you love that cast.
Right.
That's what everyone says.
It'd be funny to go back and take a look at some of those episodes and see if they hold up.
Chopping broccoli.
Right.
Yeah, actually, as a side note, I mean, I could talk about this stuff all day, but Dana Carvey got his own sketch comedy show. He basically, after leaving Saturday Night Live, they said, you can do whatever you want because he was such a big star. And I think his movies didn't really click or work, or maybe he tried that first. But anyway, he was offered pretty much anything. You want a sitcom? What do you want to do? He said he wanted to do a sketch comedy show. And there's a documentary, I think it's on Hulu, about the Dana Carvey show. And it is hilarious because his idea of what was funny was it was like Saturday Night Live, but then another step out of the mainstream. And the understanding that I got from the documentary is that the people who were funding this and in trying to get him, they thought they were going to get like a more mainstream version of Dana Carvey, like not quite as out there as Saturday Night Live, but he took it way out. They talk a lot about this bit they did called Grandma the Clown. And it's this woman and she's got a walker and she's dressed up like a clown and it's a children's birthday party and she's there to entertain. And so, it's just this like bit that crawls on where she's slow. She's got like giant clown shoes on the front of her walker, right? Like she's doing classic clown stuff, but it's an older woman. And the actress who plays she is an older woman. She nails it where she's just doing these things, but with like low energy and enthusiasm. And the sketch just goes on and on and on. And one of the writers who had been writing for Seinfeld actually quit Seinfeld after seeing that sketch. And he was like, that's comedy. That's the forefront of comedy. That's where I need to be. So it was just this amazing phenomenon. Really recommend that documentary. Great stuff.
What's the documentary called?
Too Funny to Fail: The Life and Death of the Dana Carvey Show. And it's for somebody who loves TV history and, that cast of Saturday Night Live and that time period where you had a lot of stuff, TV was peaking, I guess, in a way. And when you see like what Dana Carvey was trying to push through in essentially primetime TV, some of the sketches that they did, and it was way out there. It's probably a lot funnier as a documentary when you have the context for what they're thinking than some of the actual sketches were. So great stuff.
Is that around the same time period as Seinfeld? Because Seinfeld, wasn't that the first show that started like NBC Thursdays? Like
I think so.
Thursday night lineup or whatever.
I think it took a little time to build up to that level, but that like must-see TV thing with like Friends and so I think Dana Carvey show came after, I want to say maybe 2 seasons into Seinfeld. I mean, it was not quite at the peak of Seinfeld, obviously, but it was around that time.
Because that was a real phenomenon, right? What was it?
Mhm.
Friends, Seinfeld. And then there were other shows that were like Mad About You, I think was one of them.
Yep,
And
actually
then,
crossed over with Friends. Yeah.
yeah. And then there was one more.
Well, let's
That
see.
whole,
Brooke Shields had a sitcom for a while. They tried to slot in
that's
there.
right.
Jonathan Silverman had a Friends style sitcom that the single
That's
guy,
right.
something like that,
Yeah, the
that they
single
tried to
guy.
slide in there. Tim Allen's sitcom is a family
Yeah.
sitcom, so it wasn't that like sexy young singles type thing. But
When you said Tool
yeah.
Time, that completely threw me off.
Yeah.
Home Improvement.
Home Improvement. Wow,
Yeah.
that was close.
And then it moved into the whole Sex in the City era, kind of dominated.
Yeah, they moved out of must-see TV and moved into scripted hour-long dramas, I guess. Which they've
HBO, The
previously been.
Sopranos.
Right, Soprano, yeah.
Yeah, that
And
was
they
a
never
big
really
shift.
could recapture that Friends magic. I think it'd be interesting. I've thought about this before, is pulling together a list of shows that got at least, if as long as it was aired, at least one episode was aired, but a list of shows that were attempts to recreate Friends, because I'm sure it's massive,
Oh, I'm sure.
especially if you look internationally. I'm really curious if any of them are considered successes or like what the bar is, because Friends got such a high market share or viewer share. But then again, also those numbers just were so fragmented by even probably the end of the run of Friends. Yeah.
But you can't really, it's hard to compare Friends and those shows to anything that exists now. And the fact that there were the internet, you just didn't have that many choices back then in terms of. Right.
Well, in terms of viewership, but in terms of like Happily Ever After is obviously an attempt to clone Friends. They tried to recruit well-known actress to be the lead. They started with a dynamic that was further along in the process. Part of the struggle of Friends was, I think, is that you can only sort of hit the same notes so many times. And since it was a lot about their relationships, they sort of hit a point where it's like, well, we can't just keep doing a Ross Rachel, will they, won't they? That just gets boring eventually. So Happily Ever After tried to kind of start with a post Ross and Rachel dynamic. Did you watch that show?
No.
Okay.
Never heard of it.
I actually really like it. I think it's funny. It was a good swing at the Friends audience.
Who's in that?
Alicia Cuthbert.
Oh, yeah.
Happy Endings. Premiered 2011. She had done
a few movies. Girl Next Door, maybe.
Yep, that's right. Girl Next Door was a big one.
24. She was the daughter.
Right. So they recruited somebody who had some heat off of like film heat. So comparable to Courtney Cox, right? Courtney Cox at that time, I think, had some heat off of films. And so sort of, comparable in that way. They set up a similar dynamic and they went after the Friends audience with it. But it just didn't hit as much. I think it was a little too tongue in cheek, or like the humor was too goofy at times. Not really sure. Or just there wasn't a centralized audience available. Maybe if this show had premiered 10 years earlier, it would have been a massive hit. But I think it's worth checking out if you're a Friends fan, if nothing else, other than just out of curiosity for how Friends influenced the TV market.
Yeah. And then they did The New Girl, which I think became maybe along that vein.
I think New Girl is similar swing at the same audience. Yeah.
But that was a pretty big success. I think they ran for many seasons, right?
It did. It also had some interesting challenges, and surprisingly or coincidentally with Happy Endings. I don't know if you remember the difference. So they changed the cast after the pilot.
That's right. Wasn't it one of the Wayans brothers that was in?
That's right. And do you know where he ended up instead, or why he left? I don't understand all the ins and outs, but no. He actually didn't continue because he took a permanent position with Happy Endings.
Really? Huh.
Yep.
I did not know that.
Yeah. It was probably a contract deal. I can't imagine he thought that Happy Endings would be the more successful show. Maybe he did, but I imagine it was probably some sort of contract obligation.
And Zooey Deschanel, she's also a singer. I think she's relatively successful at it too, I think. And her sister was the lead in Bones.
Is that right?
That show on Fox.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. So this episode's getting kind of long. I do have a pitch ready. So if you want to do some story break, I can go through that.
Yeah, let's do it.
So this pitch came out really more fleshed out than usual. Usually I just have, a couple lines in my head and not much in the way of bones or connective tissue. But this one just sort of rolled out of me as a sequence. A lot of elements just sort of naturally tied together. So I just thought I would write it out, and I'll just, read it to you as it came to me or as I organized it in my head. And then I'll ask you some questions. Maybe you can tell me what you think. And if we got nothing, we'll just call it a day and move on. If it sparks anything with you, throw it out there and we'll see where that takes us.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay. So in this story, global warming has opened a new path to a never before summited peak in the remote Himalayas. 3 elite climbers set out to be the first and to document the entire experience for a documentary they hope will make them rich and famous. They hire the only person willing to guide them to the base of the climb, an unstable local living apart from the village and who speaks no English. As they progress through the mountains, they come across isolated, temperate valleys and unusual animal signs, which the guide dismisses. The 4 men reach their target and ascend to the last leg of the climb, a sheer face that will take days and require the 3 climbers to sleep in a special suspended tent. They happily leave their disturbed guide at the base camp and begin the ascent of a lifetime. The men face ice walls that shatter on contact, freezing temperatures, thin air, and increasingly ominous sounds from the valley. At times, they catch glimpses of something or someone pursuing them up the cliff, setting the men on edge and arguing with each other. A suspicious accident injures one, slowing the group down, adding another night to the climb, and bringing the unknown figure closer and closer. With the summit just over a day's climb away, the men wake to the sounds of ice and rock breaking. They look outside the tent, and the guide appears from the mist below, deranged, bloody, and armed with a single ice axe, climbing towards them. The men try desperately to slow him down by throwing rocks and extra gear while they prep for a fast climb. Just as the guide reaches them, he yells something in his language and is snatched into a crevice by a large arm with a clawed hand. Limbs and pieces of gear are tossed out and tumble down the mountain. The men stare horrified as a Yeti with black, gray, and white patches of fur climbs out and stares up at them. It has visible wounds and dried blood, the guide's missing axe broken and protruding from the Yeti's shoulder. The men flee upwards, but one by one die by their own mistakes or by being pulled off the mountain. Having lost the other 2 climbers, the last remaining man gathers the broken remnants of their gear and takes advantage of a brief storm to construct what he needs to finish the climb and survive. Starting back up during the tail end of the storm, the climber approaches the peak and stops, dangling from a dangerous position. The Yeti approaches, attacks, and is ensnared by a trap the climber built using the last of the other 2 climbers' gear. Pulling one last knot, he sends the Yeti off the face of the mountain, swinging in and out of the mist with a noose around its neck. It dies, flailing, eyes bulging, and choking out howls. The climber finally ascends to the peak, looks out toward the Himalayan mountains, then turns to see 2 Yeti standing behind him. I call it Jagged.
I like this concept. It's interesting, the whole climate change idea, because that's happening more and more, right? What's happening in the poles and finding the new viruses, et cetera. You've heard those stories, right? These dormant viruses. I'm wondering if this would be interesting as a found footage movie.
That's actually how I imagined it. Yeah.
I think that would be really cool. I like the idea of the traps, but I think in order to have those traps be really satisfying for the audience, I think there'd have to be some setup around that earlier in the story to kind of prepare you, or maybe other times they've used it or used traps in different ways, kind of just establish that character as someone who knows how to.
Yeah. Well, when they stop by one of the temperate valleys, he could construct a trap to catch something, some sort of wildlife that they want to eat or whatever.
And how do you see the other characters? Do you have them fleshed
So
out?
I had some ideas, and for this brief summary, I didn't want to waste a lot of time going off to tangents. That's actually one of the questions that I wanted to present to you, just to briefly say that I thought the lead climber would be best friends with one of the other climbers, and maybe a little bit of this idea of he feels responsible for dragging the third climber out, who's the guy shooting the footage and maybe not as capable, or his best friend is maybe not as capable, right? To give it some heart and some sense of loss. But I think the relationships are really key to making this, to giving it some depth.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the relationships are key. I think also the idea that, I know in the climbing community, from what I've seen, I'm not a climber, but I've seen some documentaries on it. It always seems to be this constant struggle between reaching the summit safely and not reaching the summit. So there's certain climbers that seem to take that risk no matter what, which is very irresponsible, a lot of times dragging other people with them. So I'm thinking in terms of this script, it would be an interesting conflict to have during the whole thing. Like, is it worth summiting? Is the weather right? Can we risk it with this guy that you're talking isn't his experience? So those types of conflicts would be an interesting thing to see in the movie. And ultimately it gets them all killed, presumably. I think there could be something there as well. I like this idea of like the deranged mystery guide who's involved, and fleshing him a little bit.
I thought about adding someone else. You know, they have someone with them who, it's either like two guides, but they don't seem to get along, and one of them speaks a little more English, or you know, this one guy who knows the way is seemingly quite deranged and odd, but the other person with them who goes along that they also hired doesn't really know the way, but is more relatable. And so after they start their ice climb, which by the way, to me is a big visual part of the film, is ice climbing, right? So there's more than a little time dedicated to that. But anyway, once they, you know, their first night up there, I was thinking about having them hear a struggle down below, and the implication being that the deranged person has attacked the other guide, because I wanted that to be sort of a misdirect.
I see. Did you see Midsummer?
No.
In Midsummer, there's this kind of feeling of dread that constricts the main characters through the entire movie. You almost feel like at any point early in the movie, they could walk out of the situation they're in and be safe. But I'm kind of getting this from this movie, where it's like, it would be interesting to show there's certain things that happen that make it impossible for them to turn back or leave the situation they're in. Because I think that would add a lot of drama and kind of anxiety for the audience, that they can't turn back. Like there's some missing equipment, or there's not enough oxygen, or like the ice axe, that they're used to do XYZ is broken, to kind of add that extra fear. And they're at a point where they can't turn back. They have to go forward. And I found that interesting about the plot in Midsummer. It's like, once they're caught in this, I don't want to ruin anything, but once they're caught in the path that they're on, it kind of makes it impossible for them to break free of it, because it's just too dangerous. And what's happening is more and more obvious to the audience, and maybe not so obvious to them. So there could be an element of that.
Could build that kind of tension.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once they start the climb, you could build that in part, or maybe even a little bit before, by introducing this idea that, yes, the climate change has opened a path, but it has also destabilized the ice and the rock in that environment. So there, perhaps maybe our main character sees signs of that on the journey to the base camp, or to the base of the climb, but is ignoring it and, kind of pushing through and pushing the others. And then as they're climbing, there are indicators that it's an unstable environment. And that this is a bad idea, but they're not trapped like you want, right? Like you like this idea, and I like it too, of the three of them feeling like, well, now we can't stop much sooner than when I introduced it.
I like the idea of the environment being unstable. So there's your threat, right? So you have to either keep going, like commit yourself to keep going, or you have to face that deranged guy. So there is kind of like a natural trap on both ends.
Once they start the climb, yeah, there's multiple elements of that. But to capture what you want, we'd have to do something like early on when they're trying to find a guide to this path they've identified via satellite photos, they encounter a community that lives on the edge of civilization in that area who is adamant that they do not go through that area. And this person that they can get to take them is an outcast, partly for that reason. Like, that's why he will go, because he's an outcast and because he has gone through there before. And the rest of the community is like, no. And then as they're hiking, they see behind them glimpses of maybe more and more members of this community in the distance, like shadowing them. You know what I mean? So they feel pressured to continue by this like growing number of people. And then at some point when they're close to the base of the climb, maybe those people vanish. Like there are fewer and fewer and then none. And if we've planted the seeds right at the conclusion of the film, there's an idea that this community is aware of this population of Yeti and has some sort of relationship with them, and was in the process of trying to stop these hikers or, you know, warn the Yeti or somehow, right? Like somehow maintain a balance that has existed in the ecosystem between these communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's similar to the plot of The Ruins. That novel is, I don't know if you ever read that novel.
Wait, is that the one with the vines that grow up? Yeah. I read the book and watched the movie.
Yeah, I did both too. I really enjoyed the book, but this idea
is good. Yeah.
That there's this like sacred place and like the native people don't want to go there, but there's, you know, the explorers that kind of, oh, we're going to go anyway. We don't believe in superstition, that sort of idea.
Yeah. So it's a classic trope in a way, but by playing off of that, we can introduce the dread and the momentum that you're trying to create. And so it also makes it more interesting, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about and get your thoughts on is that this concept is flat. It's very, very flat. And fleshing out the relationships between the characters helps. But what you're talking about now, or what we're talking about now, also makes the concept less flat, because now there's another layer of, well, gosh, now that you think about it, you know, these Yeti have probably been there for a long time. They somehow have developed a relationship of some sort. Now there's more to talk about after the film. Were there subtle signs that the community was sending them out as sacrifices? You know, that would explain this thing or that thing, you know, and just trying to herd them forward. Or were they trying to stop them or save them? Or were they just curious what would happen? Because this is a long-standing border that has been observed, and now they want to know what happens.
Yeah, I think it's a concept that could go many ways, but I think the two main ways being, one, where there's the community, the relationship with the Yeti, and like, were there signs, were they being sacrificed, etc., or is it more a straight up action thriller like The Descent? These cave explorers are in this environment, now they're being attacked and they got to get out. So that's but it was still a great movie. And the way they built tension, you know, they didn't overcomplicate things. They did create the relationship between the characters in the beginning, but you didn't feel like it was too long-winded. Really, the action that was happening between them and those creatures was really what was driving the whole plot forward. And I see something like that here, because you could have a lot of action sequences of them trying to escape the Yeti or this deranged guy as they're trying to climb this mountain, and they're kind of trapped. They can't go back. And how do they escape from that environment? And, you know, there's the whole idea of like, was this even worth it? And they're arguing about that. And they're arguing about the fact that one of them didn't even want to come in the first place. The other one brought them there. One of them's weaker than the other two. There's this tension between all the characters. So yeah, I think it's a good concept overall.
Because it's not a bad start, but it needs these kinds of elements. Like, for example, the conversation they have about, like, one of the ways the main character pressures people who aren't quite ready for this degree of climb to go do it, or one of them, is by noting or mentioning what exactly you said. Like, well, as an expert climber, the point is to ascend safely or turn back. And so that is part of the promise. And then once they start ascending, that can, you know, the added difficulty or problem, the instability of the ice or the rock or other challenges can lead to a debate around that very point. And then once they perceive someone pursuing them, you know, that debate's over. There is no like go back down. It is ascend safely or not. And so that adds some interesting elements to the dialogue and the dynamic between the characters and visuals as well.
Mm-hmm.
So stuff like that's really key, those kind of details that come.
Yeah, it's key to kind of move the plot forward in different stages, like part one, like who is this guy? Like all those questions, right, that we're trying to answer, like who is this deranged guy? What's the role of this local community? Who is this guy in relation to them? Then there's the whole challenge of getting up the mountain. Can they do it? And there's that one guy that's kind of dragging them down. So there's a lot to kind of move things forward in terms of leaving those open-ended questions that then need to be answered. Is he deranged? Yes, he's deranged, but he's fighting the Yeti. Now the Yeti's the problem. Now there's only one guy because the other two guys died. So it could definitely work, I think, as a plot. But as you said, it needs to be fleshed out with all these other obstacles or mini obstacles to get that one guy to the top and then ultimately not make it.
Yeah, the characters need arcs as well. And so if it's a horror film, then the character's arc can be around, his self-centeredness, essentially, like his unwillingness to consider other people's wants and needs on par with his own. And that can be like there can be key moments where, especially towards the end, where they lose a member of the party because he's not willing to jeopardize his own safety, right? Or wait for them or slow down or account for their skill level. He just focused on himself, and then he pays the ultimate penalty for that. But it seemingly doesn't. It seems like once he's on his own, he's at his best. That's why he survives, because he's a survivor, and those other people were holding him back. And then at the end, he pays the price for that. But that also brings up one of my other questions, and you've anticipated most of them, which I appreciate. But one of them is the ending is dumb.
It's a good question. Trying to think how you could get to that ending, have it be the same type of ending, but have that be satisfying enough for an audience.
Type of ending in what way? Like, how do you think of that as a type?
Type of ending where he gets to the top, but then he ends up being killed by the Yeti.
The ending, in my mind, a type is like, does he survive or not? Right. And that's an example of type. So he doesn't have to survive. He can survive. That's totally flexible. And maybe actually this is an example of a story where the story can write the ending. Looking back, if you want to add metaphors or depth, maybe you then make a big decision about the ending. Maybe it's too soon in the process and it's fine to have a filler ending. But it sounds like nothing's really jumping out to you as a better ending.
Yeah, nothing's really jumping out. Except I'm trying to think of a movie that was pretty satisfying that had a similar type of ending. I don't know if you saw Prey.
Oh, yeah.
It reminds me of the ending of that in a way.
Okay, so you want like Yeti spaceships to come down.
They come down and pick them up. No, but the idea that, or maybe he has another trap set for the Yeti.
Oh, for those two?
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be hilarious.
That
like, it seems like this self-centered jerk finally gets his comeuppance, and then he's like, ha-ha!
With a one-liner, like a Die Hard type of one-liner, and then they fall up the mountain.
Wire.
Yes.
It's just been revoked.
Or or they didn't notice that he stepped over this thick rope or cable that he had, a climbing rope, and he jumps off the side of the mountain. He drags them down with him,
or just slings them off into the distance. And they're like,
with a big boulder, he pushes the boulder off the side of them. And they get caught up.
Or an Indiana Jones ending where he just pulls out a pistol and shoots them both. Apparently he's had a gun the whole time.
And he's like, huh. And then he blows the smoke off the tip of the gun and it's over. Ready for a sequel.
And then the last shot is just 4 or 5 minutes of him slowly unscrewing his flask, taking a drink, getting comfortable, looking out.
It's a product placement for Jim Beam or something. What was the motivation for them? Is there a cash prize or something?
No,
or is it just them glory?
No, the idea was these are, and I just kind of tried to give the bare bones, but these guys are elite climbers. They're part of that set that's always looking for the next big peak or climb. And they've realized that there's money in a documentary or, making a name for yourself by doing something unique and new and so on. And this particular climb has never been accessible. And this guy's been studying it. And maybe one of the guys in the group is, an expert in this kind of topography or satellite mapping. And they found, there is this now there's a passage that has opened up because of melting and weather changes. And they think, man, if we're the first and we film it, $signs in their eyes. That was my thinking.
Gotcha. And that would lead itself to the found footage idea. Like
Mm-hmm.
even if they had GoPros on their helmets or whatever,
Right.
that could be something.
Yeah, and I don't think we have to explain the footage was found 400 years later, or
yeah,
because
like
they don't even bother to explain that anymore.
Like the Swedish movie we saw, where the ship ends up on another Earth 5 million years later.
Yeah, I think the ending can serve other elements of the film once they're fleshed out.
It would kind of write itself, I think.
I think so. Yeah,
you could do the Coen brothers way of writing, which I think we talked about it a little bit, which is where they write themselves into a corner.
Mm-hmm.
And all that's why their screenplays are so bizarre, because their whole thing is to just not start out with your traditional outline. They have a general bare bones idea of who these characters are. And then they put them in these situations where like they don't know how to get the character out of that situation. They'll write until they stop. And like, what's the most absurd way this character could get out of this situation? Okay, let's add that. And that continues the plot on, which makes for really creative screenwriting. So maybe something like that could happen here,
Well, that sort of harkens back to my concern that it's too formulaic. The concept is flat and formulaic. This could very easily, as I initially described it or read it, this could very easily be like a sci-fi, movie, like a relatively low budget cable movie with, I guess it's somewhat expensive to shoot ice climbing in any kind of realistic way, but you can always do tight shots and things like that and just film somewhere easily accessible. And some of the establishing shots might be expensive if you don't use stock footage. But anyway, the point is it's quite formulaic. We could make some very significant changes, or it could just kind of be largely as is with some dialogue thrown in and be acceptable, but it's not super unique or interesting.
It could be like Stallone's Cliffhanger.
I thought about that actually after I came up with the idea. I was like, oh yeah, it's a little bit like Cliffhanger, where they have a plot and they use a good bit of time to just show climbing. And I actually think that would kind of work with this, like a thinner plot. It's a fairly thin plot as is. So a thinner plot allows for more time with, kind of cool shots and learning a little bit, providing some actual knowledge about ice climbing and what those people do. And I think that's kind of interesting. If it's a mockumentary or not a mockumentary, but a fake documentary found footage style, then that would give us an excuse as writers to have the characters actually demonstrate equipment or talk about things or, explain challenges. That would require more research, but probably make the film interesting in a different way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's similar to what you saw in like Maverick when they're prepping for their mission, or any of these special forces action movies where they're prepping the mission, telling about the target, et cetera. But the target now would be the climbing and remember this gear. And, maybe they're going through all of it with the guy who's a novice, as he's packing there could be one of those scenes, like he's packing his stuff. There's more dialogue around their backstory. So that kind of adds that filler. Plus them maybe climbing on another mountain in the beginning. Right. And then that's where they hear about this passage and then they get together. There's a lot of ways to kind of establish what's happening between them early on. And for a long period of time, even like for the first 20 or 25 minutes, you could definitely fill that. And then get them to the base. And then you have all the other things that we talked. You could probably make a pretty long movie out of it if you had a lot of shots of like the actual climbing, the environment, they're prepping for it. All of that could also be part of the part of the movie.
Yeah, I have a lot of ideas of how to make the journey there more interesting. And if we explored your idea, or I guess our developing idea of the community, the locals having some sort of stake in this or role, that also leads to some good opportunities to develop character and introduce pieces that make the plot a little less thin. So I think all that's great. There is one other thing that I have a concern about with this story, and maybe it's less of a concern now, but I wanted to get your thoughts on. The Yeti appears really late in the story. And for your typical monster film, you want to start like, maybe you open with a kill, by that creature. Maybe you get little glimpses of it, or there, throughout the story, there's evidence mounting, and we can very easily do that but I just wanted your thoughts on whether it's good to have him sort of pop up unexpectedly in the third act, or if you need to see that more hints, or maybe even introduce it earlier, maybe an earlier kill. Any thoughts?
It's a good question. I think I go back to that movie Prey, and one of the things I think they did really well with that is kind of established this idea that the girl's a great hunter in the beginning, but then also establishing the alien or the predator as also having this certain hunting style and being really capable. So you know, like what she's going to be up against. Like there's that foreshadowing, you know, in the movie. But I think it's difficult to do when the plot gets overly complicated with, you know, different side characters. So we kind of have to decide, I think, is this a movie that's more simplistic? There's the Yeti and there's the, you know, the climbers, Yeti versus climbers, or is this Yeti, the range guide, the native people, the environmental, the idea that they have a relationship with the Yeti, and then there's the preparation for them climbing, because it turns it, I think, into a completely different.
Well, and the ecology of the area, because it's an interesting part of the world that has, you know, elements to it that people don't see. And also we're talking about climate change.
Yeah. So a more traditional way to do it would just be climbers.
Feature.
Exactly. Yeti versus climbers. It's a range guy who can maybe even help them or knows how to like fight them, but there's very little backstory about like where he comes from. So it just becomes a very climb the mountain, don't climb the mountain, argue about that, then end up going. And then there's the problems between the three characters, but they know who they're fighting against. You know, like there's this risk that you might be attacked by Yeti and they don't believe it at first. So there's that conflict that could make a 90-minute movie easily, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think the question is, and maybe this is for the people listening. Hi, Mom.
Hey, Mom.
Do you want a creature feature? Do you want your standard, you know, opening with a kill, but you don't really get to see the monster? Then you cut to our main characters and they're doing a big climb and filming it triumphantly. And then as the film progresses and they begin their journey, there are more and more signs, and you have some cannon fodder along with them, some other locals or other climbers who get lost along the way because the Yeti's killing them. And then in the end, there's more than one Yeti, right? Do you want that? Or do you want like something more modern or complex where there are relationships between things and you're learning a little bit about climbing and about the environment and that part of the world and ecology, and there's attention paid to the way in which the Yeti are part of the the ecology of the area, and they're living creatures. It's not a supernatural killing machine, you know, like Jaws, basically. It's more of a creature that has its own place or is part of a niche in that environment, and they have the rules that they live by. Like, what's more interesting to you?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because you can create a really interesting action movie, right? That's more centered around the Yeti versus the
beautiful
climbers.
Visuals, you know, cool stuff. Yeah.
But you can also, I think it's interesting to watch a movie where you're getting more of this really detailed information around ice climbing and what that's like and the preparation for it, et cetera. And maybe this tribe and their relationships to the Yeti. That to me is more interesting. But I've watched, you know, more simplistic movies that are like The Descent, which I thought was highly entertaining. It's just one through line. There's just monsters versus cave explorers, and they were able to make it highly, highly entertaining by having you raise that tension so much. Can they get out of that situation? So yeah, maybe that is one for the audience, because you basically make two equally satisfying versions of the same concept.
I don't know. I think it's a different, at least in my head. One is very like popcorn, laying on the couch on a Sunday. The weather's terrible, and you just want to see, you know, some people fight a monster. And the other one is like something you actually talk about afterward, because there's some ideas and you think about it and it's a little bit more heady. So I think both can work, but they're different audiences, or maybe the same audience, but at different points in their day or in their week.
Should we have people vote on our poll in the description?
Yeah, we should absolutely do that. All right. So anything else before we put this one to rest?
No, I think that was a good one. Really good concept. There's a lot to think about, a lot for the audience to think about.
Definitely a lot of room to insert better ideas. How about that?
Always.
Good. Well, as always, thanks for listening. Next week, what do you think? Maybe we talk about the Destroyer series. Maybe we talk a little bit about reality TV. Maybe we talk about Dead Heat.
Perhaps. Always Dead Heat's always in the running, so we'll roll the dice and find out.
I guess we will. Until then.
Take care, everybody.